It is great to be here. I'm looking forward to telling you all about how and why to teach physics without grades. Before I launch into that, the 2 QR codes you see are links to these slides as a PDF. I have prepared a handout with some references and some more information that I would love for you to take with you from this talk. And if you'd rather have an electronic version of that, that's what the resources QR code points to. I'll refer to that a little bit during the talk, but mainly as a resource for you going forward. Let's see, I wanted to say one other thing. Oh yeah, it's been amazing to visit Monash and to see all the fantastic teaching you do here, as I have for the past few days. I'll be here tomorrow as well, so come find me if you want to chat. It is clear that you care a lot about your students and their learning, and it's been great to see. I've also learned, as I've been here, that you as a department and as individuals operate under some rather strict requirements that come from your institution and regulations and the AIP. And I recognize that a lot of what I'm about to tell you today will seem almost impossible given some of those regulations that, to be quite honest, are like more stringent than most other places that I've been. And so I want to say that at the beginning to tell you that I think the ideas are still really interesting and thought-provoking, and I hope that you engage on that level, but also that I truly believe that there are wonderful creative ways to implement these, even given constraints. Every place has constraints. It's unique to that institution. That's no different here. And I kind of wanted to extend an open invitation to continue collaborating and chatting. And I'd love to do what I can to support those creative ways of thinking about how these ideas could play out here at Monash. So wanted to say that right at the beginning. Already, though, I've gotten ahead of myself. I wanted to start with an acknowledgement of country. I wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose unceded land we are gathered today. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I do that because we're here, but also I often do a land acknowledgement when I talk about this in the US, and even though I'm not physically there, the work that I'm about to show you was done in the US, so I think it's appropriate to do a similar acknowledgement there. I often show people this map, which depicts the many tribal nations and their pictures and their identities before contact with Europeans. And I'll say something like, I want to take a moment to consider that many of us are using stolen land and resources to attend this talk. If you are non-native, like myself, please take time in the future to learn more and to take actions to support Indigenous peoples. And I make sure to say that last sentence. I think that's important. So because the data I'm showing you and the work has done in the US, I wanted to share that with you. And then I also wanted to acknowledge that my trip here was supported by the University of Auckland, Waipapa Taumata Rau, where I have been for just about 3 months. I just started there, as Anna told you. And I look forward to developing a relationship and being more informed about my responsibilities to this country and its people. Alas, I cannot responsibly do that right now. So I hope that we'll have a chance to cross paths in the future, and I can represent my relationship to New Zealand better than I can today. Thank you for all that introduction. I wanted to start with this question, and I'm actually going to turn it to you in a sec. I want you to think to yourself, turn to those around you, and take a few minutes to come up with any answer, as many answers as you can to this question. Why do teachers grade their students? I'll give you a couple minutes now. Okay, I'm going to have to cut you off. A mentor of mine in Boulder, Valerie Aotearoa, taught education to many people, including myself, and she always says, okay, stop learning and listen to me in moments like this. But I actually want to hear some of what you said. Can I get a few brave volunteers, or folks on Zoom, feel free to put it in the chat. What were some of the things that you came up with to answer this question? Yeah, in the very back.
Grading students is a way of assessing how much they've learnt in the course, how much the course content they know.
For sure, yeah. A way of assessing how much they've learned, how much they know in the course. Absolutely right. What else? Yeah.
In Australia, grades are used for ranking for scholarships, for PhDs, and other things to advance.
Yeah. To rank and sort students, to kind of tell other people how great some students are.
representing the online chat. Liz Angstrom would like to chime in with, or has a question comment, but also that there's about rewarding efforts and rewarding the students for doing what we want them to do.
Yeah, as a reward for effort, an acknowledgement, and maybe also a motivation, if I'm reading in a little bit from that. Absolutely. One other thought? Yeah, please.
Because we've always done it.
Yes, because we've always done it. Because it's what people tell us to do, perhaps, which is not the same, but related. Absolutely right. You all thought of many of the things that a lot of people said. On this slide, I'm going to show you some of the other common answers, many of which align with what you just said. To provide formative feedback, that is, to give students information about where they should be focusing on, and in the moment feedback to help them learn and grow. To rank and sort students, we talked about that, at the end, more summative feedback. To motivate students, we hit on that. This one I don't think came up explicitly, but to evaluate ourselves as teachers, right? To know how well we're doing at our job is something that grades sometimes do. This came up to tell employers how smart students are, some students in particular, right? And exactly right, because the institution expects us to do so, right? And my takeaway, and many other reasons, of course. My takeaway from this discussion is that we ask grades to do a lot of work. They do all of these things and more. And in the end, they are A, B, C, or D, right? Maybe there's pluses and minuses. Maybe it's a little bit more complicated. But in the end, they are a single letter. And what I humbly posit is that this is a lot of work for a single letter to try to accomplish all at once. And so that's kind of the foundational idea that has led to what I'm going to tell you about today, thinking critically about grades and perhaps other ways that we can try to accomplish all of those things. So I want to start with kind of a continuation of where I've started already, giving you an overview of ungrading, what the philosophy is and what it means big picture. Then I'm going to give you a particular example from my personal experience, how I've implemented this in my intro physics course. Not to say you have to do it this way, but just as an illustration of what it can look like. And then I want to end with some preliminary research findings that I've done to kind of start to measure whether these new processes actually do what we think they're doing. So let me start with an overview of grading big picture. So it really stems and starts as a response to traditional grading that we have. So this is itself a whole field, problems with traditional grading. Let me give you a snapshot of some of the different things that research has shown is wrong with traditional grades. And as I do this, I'm going to be kind of implicitly referencing a lot of the citations on this handout that I have to you. So if you want more information about these citations and some of this work, check out the handout, let me know. There's a lot more than what I'm going to tell you in the next 2 minutes. But one of the things that early on motivated people to think critically about grades is a bunch of evidence that shows that traditional grading systems are inequitable, right? They contribute to systemic barriers, systemic marginalization in our educational systems. And there's work notably from Cassandra Paul, but also others in physics that shows that this is true, particularly in physics classrooms. That's closely related to a bunch of evidence that traditional grades do not measure what we think they measure. And in particular, they're often tied to a lot of bias, systemic bias that then relates to the inequities, right? They're often, like, what they're actually measuring isn't as well defined as some of the more kind of research-informed ways of measuring learning. But even if what you're trying to measure is well defined, there's a bunch of other things that get in the way that affect grades in ways that we don't really intend. To their role for giving students feedback, it's often true that a single letter isn't very good feedback for students. It doesn't accomplish especially that formative feedback that you want, which is often better achieved by kind of narratives or like written feedback or face-to-face consultations. That subtlety that the student needs very rarely is captured in a score, a number of points, or a letter. Classic study from Ruth Butler, 1988, showed that it actually gets in the way of that formative feedback. Like, if the presence of a numerical grade prevents students from engaging with the detailed feedback, even if it's also present in the same assignment. When it comes to a motivating factor, traditional grading undermines curiosity and motivation. It's a form of kind of extrinsic motivation that is far less effective. A bunch of social psychology research showing that internal motivation and what we often just say curiosity is much more authentic and effective at motivating students to learn. Grades aren't very great at that. And then traditional grading is no fun for instructors. One of the amazing things that I've discovered as I've started talking about this with colleagues is that no one likes grading. It's like the worst part of, I mean, maybe someone, if you like grading, more power to you. I have not met someone who says, oh, grading is the best part of my job. This paper that I'm referencing talks about the grading arms race as like a competition between students and professors that no one really wanted to be in the first place. So this is a taste of some of the many reasons that people were motivated to try to go beyond the traditional grading systems that we often use. And so that leads us to ungrading as a kind of umbrella philosophy collection of strategies in response to all the things that I just told you. But if I were to boil it down to its essence, my definition of ungrading would be de-emphasizing or removing grades as a motivation for learning, which is not to say that they're completely removed, but they're de-emphasized or removed as a motivation. That's the goal. That is to make room for more intrinsic motivation, and beyond that, ungrading can be anything and everything. It's really a philosophy as much as it is a particular strategy. There's this larger term, alternative grading strategies, that is often used. They don't mean quite the same thing, but they're very similar. So if I use them interchangeably, it's basically the same. In terms of like the landscape, ungrading is more established in that's K-12. Is that a thing we say here? Like not tertiary ed, primary, secondary ed? Yeah, cool. More established in primary and secondary education. It's growing in higher ed. Even in higher ed, it is least established in STEM. The humanities folks are well ahead of us, even in tertiary education, in terms of these things. It emphasizes formative feedback aligned with what I just told you. And in practice, what it often ends up doing is increasing flexibility. And I wanted to introduce two terms for that are just my own invention, but they help me kind of discuss and think about what that flexibility really means. So you can increase logistical flexibility. Logistical flexibility would be variation and choice in the course structure, the procedures of the course. So maybe due dates or accountability mechanisms, or like what students are expected to do in class. Those are kind of the logistics of the course. And the reason I give that a special name is because I want to distinguish it from another types of flexibility, which I call epistemic flexibility. Epistemology, loosely defined, is kind of what counts as knowledge, right? So epistemic flexibility would be variation and choice in what's actually being learned in the class, the particular content or topics that you're discussing. It's closely related to epistemic agency, which is an established concept in physics education research. I call it flexibility just to emphasize that this is less about the agency of an individual and more about the design of the course, right? The course provides flexibility that then makes room for epistemic agency. But in the end, what counts is knowledge. That's what I'm talking about. The bottom line is that ungrading embraces the idea not everyone needs to learn the same thing in the same way in order to be successful. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge, at least by picture, all of the amazing folks who have gone on this journey with me. Many of them are at WPI, but not all of them. Some of them are in PER, some of them in other institutions. I also want to highlight this book by Susan Bloom. It's a great introduction to the course, to ungrading, excuse me, and it's cited on your handout. And I have to say that this slide grows every time I give the talk, and I finally had no more room to not cover the pictures. So eventually I want to have like all of the words gone when I give this talk. These folks are amazing. The last very important point to say when introducing ungrading as a concept and as a philosophy is that it's really rooted in equity and social justice from the beginning, because the core motivation for a lot of ungrading practitioners is to lower the systemic barriers to formal education. And so that is directly related to those two types of flexibility. Logistics flexibility in particular can accommodate students with childcare or elder care responsibilities, just as an example. Epistemic flexibility can allow for different ways of learning and knowing, and that's especially helpful for neurodivergent folks, an identity that I'm going to be talking about at the end. But also just generally, anyone whose identity the STEM culture marginalizes can especially benefit from epistemic flexibility as they're trying to find ways that their own lived experience and identity fits into that of STEM. But there's a flip side here, which is these different structures and different ways of doing things can be a challenge to navigate when students aren't used to them. And in particular, one of the main threads of how people do this is relying on self-evaluation. It brings a lot of kind of subjectivity that can be subject to imposter syndrome and stereotype threat. And so while there's a lot of potential for ungrading to be really beneficial in terms of equity, it is also a caution, right? We need to keep it in mind as we make these changes and really check and ensure that it is having the results that we want when it comes to kind of DEI social justice issues. So with that motivation, there are kind of two ways to talk about ungrading. There's the philosophy, and then there's how you actually do it. So first, let me give you some examples of what the philosophy can look like. So in a way, I think of this as our degrees of freedom as a physicist. When you're thinking about what can I do, what knobs can I turn to change the course, these are the core ideas. You can mess with the levels of student agency, right? And that's agency over content, agency over structure, logistical and epistemic, two different knobs there. You can introduce explicitly metacognitive practices, learning about learning, self-reflection, peer feedback, revision, and iteration, a common thread within ungrading. You can be more explicit and intentional about what is rewarded. Like, is success in this course a certain amount of effort? Is it a certain difference of improvement from start to finish? Or is it a preset level of mastery at the end, right? There's no right answer to that question, but knowing what your answer is personally and then focusing things on it, that itself is a form of ungrading. Thinking about the types of feedback that you're giving, whether it's summative or formative, oftentimes focusing more on the formative side, that's a thread. And generally looking to achieve certain types of motivation. There's a lot of work around different kind of orientations to learning, whether you're oriented towards learning itself or reward or peer comparison, like social kind of comparison theories that come to that same like intrinsic versus extrinsic idea, showing that intrinsic motivation can really benefit students' learning. So there are actually a lot of things that you can start messing with when trying to do ungrading. And my advice to you is you don't need to do all of them because it's not all going to work in every context. Different people have different things that are important to them. Ungrading is a large umbrella, right? If you try to do all of these things at once, you're going to fail. And so the really important thing to do is to decide which resonates with you and what makes most sense in your context. Focus on that, at least at the start. Know that the larger things will come. I know I've been speaking very abstractly, so let me start to concretize this and give you a taste of what some of this can actually look like in a classroom. And so I'm going to build this list in an intentional order, starting with some relatively minor tweaks. The 4-point scale was the start of the work by Cassandra Paul. It basically means using a coarser grain of grades. So instead of all points from 0 to 100 or even more, make your grading coarser scale, right? A, B, C, or D, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Another good way to do it that I think might actually work pretty well here at Monash, given the constraints, would be just incorporating more opportunity for revision. Exam revisions were the first thing that I started with. Beyond that, there's a collection of strategies around mastery-based or standards-based or specs-based grading. They're all slightly different, but they mean basically the same thing, which is that you define where you want your students to be by the end of the course, and you allow them different amounts of time to get there. Another corner to that, not opposed, but like distinct in a lot of ways, are contract-based or labor-based grading, where you prioritize the amount of effort that students put in, and you say, it doesn't matter how far you get, as long as you're putting in the time and the effort, you're going to be successful. And then your grade is based on that. They also, especially the contract stuff, involves negotiating that at the start of the class as an agreement between the student and the instructor. Beyond that, you can completely do away with points or scores at all and focus your grading on narrative evaluations or portfolios, having students collect a series of work and kind of discuss it and present it more like an art project or an art portfolio. I say that because this approach is most common in humanities departments in higher ed. What I do is a form of self-evaluation. You ask students to assign themselves a grade and take a lot of the ownership of their evaluation on themselves. So I'll tell you more about that. Related to that is peer evaluation. Peer badging is a strategy talked about in Susan Bloom's book, where you ask students to help rank each other or rate each other. And then at the bottom of this list, there's what some might call the holy grail of ungrading, which is no grades at all. You just let students learn. And so there's this one kind of facetious example of a high school teacher who just gives students a big wooden letter A at the start of the course and say, here is your grade. Now we get to spend the rest of the year learning because we don't have to worry about this letter. That's often impossible given our constraints, but some might say that's the ultimate goal. And before I leave this slide, I just want to illustrate that there is a somewhat fuzzy order to this, where if you start to dig into the differences between alternative grading strategies and on-grading, you might say that the things further down on this list are more on-grading than the top. But even as I say that, I want to make it really clear that I don't want this word to become a gatekeepy boundary. I think it's the philosophy that is the most important. And many of these and more fit into that philosophy and are totally valid forms of ungrading. I think, yeah. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. Check out the PDF if you want to know more. The bottom line is that in my experience, I've done this in an intro physics class. I've also done it in my lab courses that I teach. And I found that it's actually inherently really well aligned with labs because your data is weird and every lab report is different. And so we've already had to grapple with some of these things in our lab courses more than we even realize. But I'm going to leave it there for now. Because I want to narrow us down and give you an example of what this can look like in an intro physics course, because that's a more universal context that most departments have. And so I want to tell you how I did this here at WPI. Again, not to say that I expect you to do exactly the same thing or that you'll be able to do exactly the same thing, just as an illustration of how this could look in a physics class. So let me tell you a bit about the physics classes that I teach at WPI. That's the Worcester Polytechnic Institute. It's about 45 minutes east of Boston in the state of Massachusetts in the northeast of the US, where I was living for 3 years before I came here to New Zealand, Australia. So I taught the intro physics courses, Newtonian mechanics. We don't do it like they do here at Monash, where we have mechanics and E&M together. This was all mechanics. But to be fair, the next semester I did it in E&M exactly the same way. But the data that I'm going to show you happen to be from my mechanics class. So I taught 80 to 100 students in one room, mostly first years, but you know how it is. You'll get seniors in your intro physics class because people live different lives. It's all good. And this is a photo of my classroom. I would classify it as a studio style space, very similar to a lot of the classrooms that I've seen here at Monash. I used a flipped classroom structure, again, very similar to here. So we try to prioritize kind of clicker questions or active engagement in class, had videos and pre-reading that students would do. Similar flavor here. They did do homework assignments. They were done online. And then I did what I used to call quizzes, and I then renamed to check-ins because quizzes had kind of connotations to them. So in class, there would be, every couple weeks, there would be a quiz that they would do. They would also do a group project at the end. Just for fun, if you get a chance to download the slides and click that link, you'll see a video that one of my student groups made for their final group project. It's awesome. I tell you that for context. I hope that none of that is particularly surprising, right? I think of it as a fairly typical research-informed intro physics class. What was atypical about it is that there were no grades. So instead of grades, I asked students to do self-evaluation. So what that looked like is students would set their own goals at the beginning of the course. They would answer these questions on a survey on Canvas, course management software. Where would you like to be at the end of the course in terms of your understanding of physics, being prepared for class and lab, participating in class and lab, and your work with other students? And I picked those prompts because those were the things that I thought were important for my learning goals in my course. Then a bunch of stuff happened in the middle that I'm going to tell you about. And then at the end, students assigned themselves their own grade. They had to figure out whether they met those goals. They had to provide justification. And then they would tell me what grade they thought they earned. And I gave them some guidelines. For example, an A means that you met or exceeded all of your goals, and so on. And then, in the vast majority, I reviewed it all, and in the vast majority of cases, like 90%, I entered the grade that the students assigned to themselves into the university system, and that's the grade that they received in the course. And in some cases, my perception of their work was not the same as what they wrote. And so we would communicate. I'd send emails. I'd tell them, you said this, but I observed this. Can you tell me more? Am I missing something? And 9 times out of 10 of that already 10% of the class, it was very clear and we came to an agreement. Either the students said, oh, you're right, or the students said, oh, actually, like this thing happened and I hadn't told you about it, or it wasn't in my evaluation. Here's more evidence. It was pretty straightforward. And in a very few number of cases, like I think there have been, I could count the number on one hand in the 8 times that I've done this. We could not agree, several back and forths, reached an impasse, and in that case, I assigned them the grade that I thought that they should receive. But that was a very, very small number of students. I use a similar approach in my advanced lab class. Minor differences, I could tell you that more if you want afterwards.
Can I ask is it all right if I interrupt?
Yeah, please, go for it.
When you came up with your grades, did you come up with them before you looked at the grades they gave themselves, or did you?
No, but I'm glad you asked. So the question was, did I come up with my own grades before I looked at their evaluation? I didn't, because that's way too much work. I read what they wrote, and I knew them at that point. But it is true that the first time I taught this, I didn't use the system. I used a traditional point system, and I didn't change much of the course structure. And so I made sure that it would be possible to go back and calculate a score if needed. And I even told that to the students. They could write in for their goal that I want to get a 90%. And that's a fine goal. Very few students wrote that. But that was a fallback option that I only did if it became necessary in those back and forths. Yeah. Yeah, go for it.
That's a very short question. Because is there not a risk that then this unfairly disadvantages people who are maybe a bit less self-confident because they might rate themselves worse and then maybe unconsciously incentivize when you're yeah, true.
Yeah. So the question was, is there a risk that this might, what was the word, bias or kind of harm students who are less confident? That's a huge risk, especially when it comes to dimensions of oppression and identity. Hold that thought, because I was very concerned about that, and there are certain things I try to do to mitigate it. I also think on some level it's an open question to really make sure that we're getting the positives and not some of those negatives. So very astute, absolutely right. I'm gonna keep going from now, but keep them coming. No, this is great. So let me show you a little bit more about what that looked like. This is a screenshot of the goals survey that I had students fill out at the beginning. Here's the one question about what would you like to be by the end of the course in terms of your understanding of physics. And the reason I'm showing you this is because it's a lot less open-ended than you might think. I gave them these examples of goals that I thought would be valid. They're by the end of the term, I want to be able to solve every problem on every solo check-in. Remember, that's what I called quizzes. Many students literally just copied and pasted that as their goal, right? You can see the others here. I also gave them, these goals are the right idea, but they're a little bit vague, because in the first time I had students say I want to be able to explain these ideas to anyone off the top of my head, which is great, but hard to measure. And so I would say, can you rewrite this that's after every week I'm going to call my grandmother and I'm going to tell her this is what I learned in physics, and I want to make sure that I can kind of say that. Something more concrete that they could measure. there's, sorry, I'm pausing because I'm like, how do I tell you this? There's another really weird thing about WPI that I need to tell you in order to contextualize the research findings that I have at the end. WPI does our academic calendar in a very strange way that I'm going to tell you now that I'm on the other side of the world, I think is really terrible. Don't do it this way. They compress their courses into 7 weeks. Their semesters are 7 weeks long, and students typically take 3 courses in those 7 weeks. So all of intro mechanics is 7 weeks long. And then the next 7 weeks, they have a new set of courses, and they do intro E&M. Courses are half as long as they are. And the contact hours are a bit more per week than in a normal semester, but not twice as much, because that would be too much work. You end up getting about 3/4 of the contact hours of a normal semester-long course. And so this is the schedule. These are the weeks of the term, Monday through Friday are on the top. I met with my students for an hour every single day of the week to teach them intro mechanics in 7 weeks. That is important context for the thing at the end. But the other reason I'm showing you this is I wanted to just highlight kind of the flow of the course. So introduction, I told them about ungrading. We dive right into vectors on day 2. Their goals survey is due in the middle of week 3 or the beginning of week 3. So they have a taste of the course before they're setting their own goals. They do a practice self-evaluation about 2/3 of the way through the course. And then their final self-evaluation is due at the end of the course, because if they don't do that, I can't assign them their grade. The other reason I wanted to bring this up was getting to responding to your question. I set aside 3 days, specifically what I called ungrading days, to talk about the things that we normally don't explicitly teach in physics classes. Metacognition, self-reflection, self-evaluation. And this is one of the days where I did a whole day talking about stereotype threat and imposter syndrome as one way to address some of the issues around how to do unbiased and faithful self-evaluation that isn't as susceptible to some of the concerns, which I can tell you more about. I don't think it's the full solution, but it's the one thing that I did. And so these ungrading days were the most weird thing that happened in the class itself. Otherwise, it was exactly the same content and structure that I had during the normal course, just that there were no points assigned at the end. So I did a day on metacognition, thinking about self-evaluation and kind of the importance of being aware of how you're learning. I did a day on productive failure, about how it's often more than just success and failure, but whether that failure or success is productive or unproductive, whether you learn something in the long run. And then I did a day talking about imposter phenomenon and stereotype threat, told students about the finding from social psychology that one of the best ways to avoid imposter syndrome and stereotype threat is just to be aware of it. And we talked about self-affirmation, and we talked about how to do self-evaluation that's based on objective evidence, that's based on measurable goals, so that they can be perhaps less subject to that unintentional bias. And I don't have time to go through those activities in detail, but they are in the bottom of the slides, and I'm happy to send you the materials after the fact. Yeah, go for it.
So from time to time I have some unproductive days, and I always feel that I failed. What's unproductive success?
Oh yeah, I'm glad you asked. In fact, do I have time? Yeah, let's just jump to that slide if you don't mind. So now that I'm glad you asked that question, because then I get to say that I stole this from my husband, who is an academic coach. And this is what he talks about with his students. This is one of the slides that I present to my students when we do this. Productive success maximizes both long-term learning, short-term performance and long-term learning, and the 4 quadrants, as you can see. So productive failure, that's you overslept for your exam, so you were super unprepared, you got a really, didn't perform very well, but you learned from that experience, and you learned what it took to kind of set an alarm and like take care of yourself the night before, so that every other exam you take for the rest of your life, you're super prepared, right? Productive failure. As opposed to unproductive success, you woke up, forgot you had an exam, crammed for it, did pretty well, but then forgot everything that you crammed 3 hours later, right? You've maximized your short-term performance, but you've minimized your long-term learning. There you go. Brief nugget of productive failure. Does that start to answer the question? Cool. I agree. It's good stuff. And stuff that we rarely teach students. So like PER folks would often call this the hidden curriculum, right? Things that we hope students learn, but we don't explicitly teach them. So I tried to explicitly teach them that. Just to complete this story, here's what the final self-evaluation looks like. For each goal, it asks them to look back at what they wrote and then to tell me yes or no whether they met the goal, and then to give me the justification as to why. Come on, you can do it. There we go. And then after all of those, I asked them to tell me the grade that they earned. This is a survey that they fill out on our Canvas, our online course management system. It's also important I ask what other considerations went into your choice of final grade. It's important for me to get a complete picture of their evaluation, and this is a hard thing to do. So it's part of the skills that I want to teach. The last recommendation or kind of nugget I have before I tell you about some of the research is you don't have to do it that exact way, but of all of the ungrading practitioners who I've talked to and my own experience, the most important thing to do is to tell your students about why you're doing it, because buy-in is really important. And if you just do it, it's going to be real weird and they're not going to understand and it's not going to go well. But if you get students to buy in, it can be amazing. They've spent 12 years being traditionally graded. The rest of the world is still pushing them to care about their grades. You face an uphill battle when you're messing with some of these things in your class. And so you got to be really transparent about not just what's going to happen, but why you are doing it. And you have to do it early and often. You have to do it at the beginning, and you have to keep reminding them. Because students are busy and they're stressed, and this is very strange to them more than to you. And you need to kind of assure them that it's going to be okay and remind them of that, and to kind of show them as well as tell them that you're for real. You're not going to kind of pull the rug out from under them and be like, haha, psych, 5 out of 10, screw you, right? They'll worry about that. But if you get that buy-in, it's amazing what students will do in response. And it's beautiful, the internal motivation that just flourishes when you've removed those extrinsic barriers that come from working for a grade. Cool. So that's one example. Again, happy to share more details, more course materials if you're interested. But I want to take the last few minutes that I have to tell you about some of the research that I've done. It's all preliminary. It's all kind of nascent. But even so, there are some really exciting indications that the stuff that I just told you about is actually pretty cool. So the first thing that I wanted to share was one of the first concerns I had. Just, is this radical new approach harming students in the traditional ways that we expect them to learn? And so there were two ways that I looked at that. They're both pretty quantitative. This is a plot of the grade distributions from my class over the different terms that I taught it. So A, B, C, and NR at WPI, those are the only 4 grades you can get. NR stands for no record. It's basically failing, but it really just means you have to take the course again. The white bars were the first time I taught this course when it was traditionally graded. There were exam revisions, but other than that, it was points, and your score was your score. And all the other colored bars are the other semesters that I've taught intro mechanics. And there are about twice as many of those if you include the E&Ms, but those are a different beast with different students. So for purposes of comparison, I just plotted the mechanics ones. So big takeaway, the grade distributions are roughly the same, right? So to the extent the grades are measuring what we want them to measure, which is a big question mark, at least the grade distribution isn't radically different when students assign themselves their grade than when I assigned it for them, which I think is really cool. You might not have expected that. I also want to note that, depending on what you're used to, you might say wow, Ben gives a lot of A's, and that's true. But this is a similar grade distribution to all the other professors who teach intro mechanics at WPI. It's actually fairly consistent for intro physics at my institution. We could have a whole other conversation about grade inflation, which we're not going to go there right now. Let me just say that I'm proud of my department for giving an A when they think that students have achieved what they need to achieve in their course, and that if they're doing their job right, everyone should get an A, because everyone should achieve what they need to achieve from a course. So I think with that underlying philosophy, that's one of the reasons actually that the grade distribution might have been similar. But as I've just told you a lot about extensively, I don't think that grades are a very good measure of learning anyway. And so I was thinking, what else could I do to really make sure that students are learning what they need to learn in an intro mechanics course besides just my grade distribution? And so I resorted to using the force concept inventory, which is super established in PERs, kind of the first like research-based assessment instrument or survey that measures conceptual understanding in physics. It's the sort of like kind of survey test that you give at the beginning and the end, and you look at the difference, right, the gain between before the class and after the class. For those PER nerds in the room, I actually switched to the HFCI, the half FCI, for logistical reasons, and we can tell you about that if you're curious. But it's basically the force concept inventory. And before I tell you the results, which I will in the next slide, I just want to say that the point of ungrading is not to increase your FCI scores, right? It's to do all those other things that I told you about that are not measured by conceptual understanding. But I did it anyway. I'm going to show you anyway, just because I thought it was really important to check that this new approach didn't harm students' conceptual learning, because I still think that, you know, it's an important thing. When you take intro mechanics, you should learn some intro mechanics concepts, right? So the other nice thing about the FCI is that it's been used a ton in the past. And so this is not my own data. This is from this like kind of review article that aggregated data from a bunch of different courses all over the world. It distinguished it between traditional and interactive engagement. And this is the distribution of like class-wide FCI scores over like decades of research. And I gotta give a little explanatory comma here. They use this metric called normalized gain. So the gain would be your post score minus your pre-score, but they normalize it by the total amount that you could possibly gain, right? So if you got perfect score in the post-test minus your pre, that's the maximum gain you could get. That's what normalized gain is. So I'm going to use that same metric just to facilitate this comparison. These are the values that I got, you know, average over all the students in my course. My section is the top bar. All the other sections of intro mechanics, because there were about 5 or 6 different professors teaching different sections. Oh, I should say, because here in Monash, one professor teaches the course for the entire 7 weeks, right? Unlike here and in New Zealand, we don't kind of share sections, like different scheduled times will be taught by different people, but it's the same person for the whole course for the same set of students. So this comparison effectively compares my ungrading to the average of all the other traditionally graded courses. And 2 takeaways. One, well, okay, I'll skip to the less exciting one. The number is about 0.27, which is about there on the plot. And so that in itself is a little bit worrisome, because like we do kind of the interactive engagement that you'd hope. And I think this might be due to the 7-week terms. Like it happens so fast. So open research question there. But for my purposes, the important thing is that even kind of within these more narrow error bars, the learning gains in my ungraded section were the same as the others. So this is encouraging, right? But I also want to say that way more data is needed here. And I'm currently working with some other ungrading physics educators in the US to do a more large-scale study, just to continue to establish this. I see there are a couple questions. Yeah, let's go for it. Yeah, interactive engagement, like research-based teaching, studio style, not just sitting up and lecturing like I'm doing to you right now. What you all are familiar with here at Monash. Yeah.
So there were 80 students in the introductory.
Yeah.
How many of those were in your section?
Oh yeah. Sorry to be confusing there. The 80 students were in my section, so I taught 80 to 100 students, and then there were 5 or 6 others. So we teach about who are taught traditional. Yeah, still interactive engagement, but traditional grading. Okay, some of them were interactive, some of them were less, depends on the instructor. Wasn't as uniform as here. But in terms of the numbers, well, what, about 600 per, in all of the physics department taking these classes every term. Thanks for that. All good? Cool. So that was a good sanity check. Nice to know that we're not harming their conceptual understanding. But those numbers don't tell the full story. And actually, the point of ungrading isn't to increase your FCI score. It's to do all these other amazing things, right? It's about more the conceptual understanding. And so the rest of the research I'm going to show you is more qualitative to start to understand some of the other benefits that come from this approach. And so I'm going to show you work of 2 undergrad senior theses and 1 master's student's work to start to understand some of the other benefits that come from ungrading at WPI. So initial work by Ben Petke, who's now a high school physics teacher in the US, good for him. We wanted to know, what is the emotional impact on students? How did it affect their motivation? And what were their perceptions of fairness in ungraded classes? And so we reached out to students in ungraded courses, mine, but not only mine, because there are other professors in other departments at WPI who do similar things. But I should say WPI is a polytechnic school, so they're all STEM. It's math, well, you know what STEM is. All STEM classes at WPI. And Ben also interviewed the professors, not me, because I was his research advisor, but other professors who were teaching in this way. So in the end, 11 interviews, 3 of them were professors, transcribed, analyzed inductive thematic analysis to start to pick out some of the common themes in what people talked about. And focusing on those 3 things: emotional impact, motivation, and fairness. So let me give you a kind of synthesis of what came out of each of those. So for motivation, people would say things like, I think it's really good for students because it keeps you self-motivated, because you're working for your goals that are specific to you, right? We see that internal motivation coming out, desire to dive into topics deeper that they found interesting. However, we also saw that people said a benefit to traditional grading is knowing exactly what you're supposed to be doing, so you don't have to figure anything out. And so I think this is a reminder to us that we need to focus on making learning objectives clear and explicit, especially since the numerical scales are absent. This is a good thing to do in general, but it becomes more critical when you remove that implicit messaging from the numerical scores. When it comes to fairness, people felt like it was more inclusive. People could find the way that they learn the best, and this is true both for students and teachers. They felt like it gave them a lot of freedom to learn at their own style and their own pace. But also, you can't just throw them in the deep end of the pool. It's at the interface where the difficulty lies. The essence here is that the outside world still demands grades, and there's still tension at the interface. So no matter what, assigning grades is tricky. Even in an ungrading situation, that remains true. Lastly, for the emotional impact, students overwhelmingly said that they were a lot less stressed in this class. They actually want to do the work. Students and teachers both expressed lower levels of stress because, at least I discovered this, it's really stressful to have to decide whether a student gets an 8 out of 10 or an 8.5 out of 10. And I didn't have to do that anymore. It was awesome. Changing from a grading scale 0 to 100 to pass-fail, because one of the professors did it that way, is definitely a big adjustment. And generally, students and teachers found it difficult to shift their mentality away from they've always been graded. It's just hard to do things that are different. And that's true for students as well. So complex picture, more to kind of look in there, but that was the general landscape. That I think the takeaway there is that the same things that we wanted to have happen came up in students' experiences. Real quick, I'm going to say that Mike McGregor looked into how this affected group work and group dynamics. This is especially relevant for interactive engagement classes like you all do here. There were 2 main findings, similar kind of interview study, regarding these identity-mediated group dynamics, like how you interact with your partners, especially given your own identity. It felt like ungrading put everyone more on an even playing field, creating more equality. And also about motivation. Students particularly said they liked their ungraded courses because they still had unmotivated team members, like slacker teammates, but they said it didn't matter as much when they weren't so worried about, whether they were going to get a passing score or not. The other amazing thing from Mike's work, it was qualitative, but we counted up the number of codes that were positive or negative in the different things he looked at. And so this represents what students talked about, right? The things that were important to them. And when it comes to identity, when it comes to issues of inclusion in physics, the things students talked about were overwhelmingly positive when it comes to ungrading. So I think there's more to be researched there as to what really is hidden in this blue bar, but early positive indication that this is really great in terms of equity and inclusion. The last research finding I want to share with you is Gabby's work on ungrading and neurodivergence. And so we specifically wanted to look at this as a particular marginalized identity because we think there was a lot of opportunity for ungrading to help with neurodivergence, but also that there's a lot of potential for it to be harmful if not done in the right way. And so it was important to kind of do that as a check as well as an evidence of this potential. And before I show you the results, I just got to give you a couple disclaimers. First of all, neurodivergence is a broad term, comes as many identities, and some are associated with medical diagnoses and others aren't. And ultimately, it's the oppressive systems that result in people being marginalized, not an internal property of themselves. Nonetheless, when we asked participants to self-identify, we used some of that medical language that pathologizes neurodivergence, and we did that consciously because we wanted to use language that the students recognized and could identify with. And the reality is many students with neurodivergent identities get that from the medical diagnoses that they have received. And so we wanted to kind of use language that was familiar to them, while also kind of hating the fact that we were using this pathologizing language. We allowed students to identify open response as well. And if students didn't respond in any open way or with one of these categories, then they were categorized as neurotypical. And so we conducted focus groups with shared identity and individual interviews of students in ungraded classes with various forms of neurodivergence or neurotypical students. And we did a similar kind of emergent analysis with themes that fell into different of those categories. So I'm going to give you an overview of that now. First, students with developmental disabilities, autism, ADHD, for example. Students with a mental health disorder, depression, anxiety, for example. And then neurotypical students, right? So first, things that many of the students in these categories shared, right? Themes across those different identities. They all noticed that the motivation, the internal motivation was really helpful. I kind of remind myself so I say the right thing. Yes, the logistic flexibility was represented by all students. But in particular, with the mental health disorder folks, the flexibility with time constraints made coursework more manageable was something that specifically came about from folks with depression, anxiety, those sorts of experiences. Whereas the students with developmental disabilities talked a lot about both challenges and opportunities about that, the need to create their own structure, right? So they talked about a lack of confidence with creating their own course structure and sometimes a struggle with the lack of deadlines. But it was only the neurotypical students who specifically said that they wanted clearer instructions. And the folks in the developmental disabilities focus group more talked about how kind of they recognized that it was a struggle, but also that it was an important thing to learn. And that some of them even appreciated the challenge. So all populations noticed that intrinsic motivation, the logistic flexibility was highlighted, especially by the mental health disorder folks. The lack of structure was both a challenge and an opportunity. Those are the preliminary research, way more to be said there, but I wanted to share with you the highlights of what I've found so far. So thank you all for your attention. This is my last slide. My takeaways are that grades are inequitable and bad for learning. That there are many reasons to do ungrading, while there are some challenges. There are many approaches to do it. It's not one size fits all. And that when it comes to the research, it's in the early stages, but there are some growing and promising results even at this point. Thank you so much for your attention. Looking forward to chatting.
It's my understanding that Sweden has been doing effectively ungrading for generations. and I'm curious whether there are any takeaway messages from that. I have my own experience with former students who went through that, who generally weren't particularly happy, but that may be because as a consequence of the kinds of students I tend to pick up. So I grant that may not be representative, but do you know if there are studies, given that it sort of provides a cohort of people who went through different experience?
Yeah, definitely. So the question was about Sweden in particular and how this is perhaps more prominent in other countries, Sweden in particular. And I think I have two responses to that. One is you're absolutely right, and that you're right that some students think it's not very great and that it's hard to kind of tease that out, right, from the individual anecdotes, but it's fair. The other thing I have to say is I'm not an expert in Sweden in particular, but in general, this is much more established in the secondary and primary education. And I think that's perhaps true in Sweden as well, because I do know some physics professors who teach in tertiary education in Sweden, and they don't do ungrading, but my sense is that it's still very point-based. And when it comes to kind of national exams and like high stakes final assessments, I know that at least in, I think Delft in Sweden, it's similar there. But perhaps you know more than me, you should totally correct me if I'm wrong. But I think in terms of the research results, I don't know of anyone in higher ed STEM who's researched this in Sweden, but I know that like in the School of General Child Development and primary education, there are a bunch of research results that show that general education systems and in Scandinavian countries have some good benefits.
I have a question from Zoom.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Liz?
Oh, thanks. I was wondering, Ben, if you're interested in collaborations, because we've also graded first year physics at the University of New South Wales, and I'm chairing a working party at the moment where we're looking at introducing ungrading across a number of courses, like across all the faculties. So we're currently developing like a research proposal with pilots and stuff. So I was wondering if that's like, it sounds like you've done quite a lot of research into this already. So what would be very relevant and helpful for us if you would be interested in collaborating.
Fantastic. You heard it here first, everyone. Yeah, that sounds amazing. Let's be in touch. Sorry, there's a funny echo going on here. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, that's amazing. Let's follow up. I would love to do that. I think this is a good segue to something more general, but my direct answer is yes, let's be in touch. As ungrading in physics becomes more of a research topic than it is, I think it's important for us to avoid some of the pitfalls that earlier PER topics have fallen into, where they look at a narrow, non-representative sample of institutions and then find that the results don't translate very well outside. And so I'm thinking, just because this was done in the US and now we're in Australia, but more generally, it's really important for me to reach out to a variety of different institutions. There's a two-year college community in the US that is really vibrant. I want to make sure that the research represents a variety of students and institutions from the beginning, because it's so institutionally dependent, that we need to make sure that what works in terms of the research findings is representative of the broad range. And so I think international collaborations would be great for that reason in particular. Yeah.
So the list of goals, students' definitions of success that you provided as prompts seem to be fairly similar to the sort of things we traditionally expect to work through most of the problems. I'm interested in how far would you accept goals that differ from traditional objectives, and in particular, one of the things we do with grades is how are you ready to go to the next year in this discipline?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. The question was, like, the goals that I said were pretty typical. Like, how much am I willing to allow students to go beyond that? And the answer is, I'm pretty flexible, but I do think it's my responsibility as an educator to make sure that they're prepared for what comes next in a way that they wouldn't know themselves. And so sometimes I do give them that feedback. Like, oftentimes students will say, well, I'm a aerospace engineering major. My goal is to learn what I need to know for aerospace. And and really, like, that's different than my goals, but more so, it's just really hard to measure. And so the most common feedback I have for students is, it's too vague. How are you going to know you met this? And so for that student, I'll say things like, that's fantastic. Why don't you go talk to your aerospace engineering professors and ask them, what do I need to learn in my physics class to be successful for aerospace engineering? And then based on what they say, go back and revise your goal with those specific things. And I didn't mention this, but there was a revision process for their goals, like based on their feedback. They give me revised ones so that I ensure by the time their goals are set, they meet that responsibility that I have as well as themselves. There's one other thing I wanted to add. You're right that those goals are very traditional. They don't have a lot of epistemic flexibility, right? I still choose what topics are in intro mechanics and what appears on the quizzes. They just choose how much it counts. And so I'm toying with what would happen if instead of letting them write whatever they wanted, they could just kind of pick from a preset list, because the reality is 90% of students end up writing basically what I wrote. And it would save me a ton of time when I have to read through them all. But it's an open research question, because I think there might be something lost there. I think it's the act of choosing your own goal and then being responsible to it might be really important. So open question, whether the act of writing it in your own words is critical or not. I saw a question here, yeah.
Everybody's often integrated first year. It's commonly alright. What happens when these students go second, third year? What's the situation? You got one student, so there you go.
Oh, I wish. To do that, we'd need multiple professors doing this throughout the curriculum. I do it in my advanced lab course. It's honestly less of a big lift there because students are already more internally motivated, and lab courses tend to be more kind of like student-centered anyway, just because everyone's lab report is different. I think it would be amazing to do a longitudinal study, but I imagine it being kind of far off until we get a full curriculum, a full department, doing this holistically. The one other thing I'm going to say though is, it is a concern that students might not be prepared for the next class, especially for an intro physics course that's often a prerequisite. I have had some anecdotal evidence from future students that that they feel very well prepared. If anything, they feel more prepared because they've had to more authentically engage with the content. I think it would be a great study to just do follow-ups on students who took an ungraded intro class and then see how they did in more traditionally courses in the future. That's an easier thing that I'll want to research. But I sleep well at night because I recognize that in the end, the bar is real low, because when you actually measure how much physics students remember a year or two later, it's depressingly small. And so it's not all bad. I think that the important learning that students get from physics is so much more than just, do they remember Newton's laws and can they solve problems? And I actually think that what we do here does that really well.
I'd just like to clarify the timeline. So from the table you had before about the curriculum, they set out their goals in week 3.
Yeah, let me bring that up again.
Of the 7-week semester, and there's a revision process wherein there's a bit of a back and forth as to clarifying what they actually are.
Yeah.
So they won't have concrete goals until week 4.
Yeah, I mean, and it varies, week 4, week 5, about halfway through. Yeah. Nonetheless, they have something that they're working towards by week 3. And it is, now that you bring it up, it's a bit odd, what are students doing for the first half of the semester when there's no... But the amazing thing is, they've spent 12 years showing up to class every day and basically doing whatever they're told. And so they don't even notice in the first week of class that they don't actually have to be doing all of their assignments because they haven't written their goals yet. They just do it because... And I think that's one of the benefits I have working in tertiary ed. These are students who, I know they didn't fully choose, maybe their parents told them to go to college, but there's a selection bias here. Students are there for a reason. They're interested in learning by the time they come into my class. I'm privileged to be able to teach those students, and I think it does help.
Yeah, I teach first year physics, I teach first year astronomy, and I've surveyed the students this year, so it's more than 200 students at the start to find out their motivations and interests.
and it's completely elective, so it doesn't count you for the astronomy major. And that, what if the students, the biomed students, are motivated to go into medicine, and so they want grades? So their whole point of being in that course is they think it's easy and they think they're going to get a high six. And they're really honest and upfront. I don't think they care about the content. So I think that is a motivation. If they weren't doing that they aren't there really to learn about astronomy. So I think if you took away the grades, I reckon the course, the enrollments would drop by 25%.
Well, perhaps. So the question is, for students, so intro astronomy class, for example, for students for whom physics is not their major, in particular people in med school, they're often there explicitly to get the grade. Oh, excuse me, pre-meds then. Yeah. People trying to get into med school. Even more grade pressure there. Yeah. And so if you took away grades, wouldn't, the enrollment might drop by a huge amount. That's fair, but to be honest, I hear that a lot. So let me give you my two kind of canned responses, and then we could have a longer conversation. One of them is, they're still getting credit for the course. It's just within the course where the grade comes from. And so, my students get credit for my course. They walk away with their A or B or C, depending on how they're assigned. And the med school, anyone who looks at their transcript would have no idea. And so my experience with pre-med students is they care a lot about their grades, and they're some of the best students in this because they're the ones who proactively reach out and they say, I'm really worried because I don't know what's going on in this class and I need to get a grade or an A to get into med school. And so I ask them to meet with me in my office and we talk about, what are your motivations for doing this? And what comes out is, I really want to be, so one student wanted to be a vet, actually, a veterinarian. And she told me about why she wanted to be a vet and how she thought that science was really interesting, but she doesn't see it in all of her classes, and a lot more to that conversation. But in the end, she wrote some fantastic goals that were very specific to her particular journey that were so motivating. She was one of the best students I had in the class, and she earned her A better than anyone else. And she got the A, and the med school, didn't know any wiser. So I think there's a lot of potential even in those contexts. But the other kind of response I have is when it comes to the research, I was surprised. The most research on pass-fail grading is actually coming from medical schools. It's a trend, especially during and post-pandemic, for medical schools to realize the harm of this high-stakes grading, and they are starting to transform towards these things in their own practices. And so I don't know where that's going to go, but it might change the tenor of med and pre-med students that we see in the future.
Just a short question, which is kind of related maybe. I'm just wondering if from your experience this still works when there's other parallel courses with for the students that are maybe graded more traditionally and maybe have quite hard exams, because I can imagine that then in that case if they're I don't actually have to do this quiz or this assignment, whereas I get graded for the other one, then they might maybe not do it anymore.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was following the beginning. You asked about how does this work when some courses are graded and some courses are ungraded.
It's also graded, but during during the semester they don't actually have to do the activities to get the grade, maybe.
Right. I think a couple of thoughts there. It is true that the homework assignments and on the content that I use is the same, whether it was a graded class or an ungraded class. And when I started at WPI, I borrowed those materials from the other teachers who teach it. So on the surface, the students are doing the same activities. They're just kind of ranked and incentivized in different ways. The other thing, yeah, please.
No, I just meant that okay, if they have this quiz due one day, but they also have another exams, then they might prioritize the one that is actually graded. Or,
oh, I misunderstood. I thought you meant my physics course is ungraded, my colleague's physics course is traditional, but you mean a student's physics course is ungraded, but their chemistry course is traditional.
Or any other course they take.
Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. That's a great question.
Something due, if in both courses there's something due, but yours is not graded, but the other one is graded, they would.
How do they prioritize?
They would probably prioritize what is graded.
Yeah. So, okay, thank you for that question. I've seen both. So when students have to decide, do I do my assignment for my ungraded course or my graded course? Some students prioritize the graded one, and then maybe in the end, so like they do their chemistry assignment because they know there's a late penalty. Whereas for my course, they maybe put that off. That happens, but just as often I hear students say, I love doing your physics homework first because it's a lower barrier to entry. Like I get so stressed by my STEM courses, and your physics homework is a warm-up that then allows me to do my chemistry in a way that I probably would just procrastinate on otherwise. So I've seen both ways. But the other kind of philosophy I have is that students are under such extreme pressures, and I want to see them as whole people and allow them to take care of themselves. And so if the flexibility in my course allows them to make meaningful decisions about their other classes or about taking care of their ailing grandmother or something, right? I actually think that's a bonus, even if it means that they spend less time doing physics problems. Yeah.
I'm going to ask the question that you thought Marie was asking at the start, which is, so how many semesters did you do this study?
Terms, because they're 7 weeks long. So, twice as much as you'd think. I've done it about 8 times.
Okay. Do you think, given that there are concurrent other section, right, like in a given term, there's somebody else teaching it in a different way, yeah?
Yeah.
Do you think there's a selection bias of students who are choosing to take it with you?
Yes.
And that you get students who are more excited to be in this class, opting to take it with you instead of someone else?
Yeah, for sure. So the question was, is there a selection bias because I teach in this way and other professors teach it in different ways? I was worried about that. And so in the quantitative data sets, I looked for any indication of a bias that students were enrolling in, that different students were enrolling in my class than others. And I could find 0 indication of that. By far, the most common, like the prevailing indicator for how students choose what course to take is the scheduling and whether they have a course conflict or not. But the other benefit to that is that I teach the first year courses most of the time in the first semester. And so students haven't heard the rumors about who the good professors are yet. They're signing up for my class a few months before they've even arrived at the institution. So it's kind of a benefit there. But when I teach the course in the second semester, I'm always oversubscribed. So I think there is the rumor mill that comes out. I do become a popular professor, but every year it resets.